Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal Tracy had spent a lifetime perfecting the art of control. In Port Charles, where allegiances shifted like sand and every smile could conceal a dagger, she had learned early that survival meant more than simply reacting to threats. It meant anticipating them, manipulating them, and, when necessary, eliminating them. To outsiders, she projected the image of a dignified matriarch, a shrewd businesswoman whose sharp wit and calculated decisiveness had kept the Quartermain name formidable through decades of scandal and upheaval. But those who truly understood Tracy knew she thrived on power the way others thrived on air, and that power was sustained only by a willingness to sacrifice anyone, even those closest to her, if they threatened her grip on it. The scandal surrounding Sonny's investment in deception was, to most, just another in a long line of complications that could be finessed away with strategic silence and legal maneuvering. To Tracy, however, it was an existential crisis. The revelation that Sonny's capital had been tainted with laundered funds was not just a legal liability. It was a stain that could spread, damaging her standing, destabilizing the company, and providing her enemies with an opening they would seize without hesitation. When Natalia, whose testimony could have blown the situation wide open, died suddenly, the loss was a double-edged sword. On one hand, the most obvious external threat had been removed. On the other, the path to absolution had narrowed to a single fragile thread. Tracy understood that time was no longer on her side, and hesitation would be fatal. Her assessment of the internal landscape quickly identified the true danger, Maxie. Where Brooke Lynn, Lucy, and Tracy herself were content to close ranks and bury the matter, Maxie clung stubbornly to the idea of full transparency. She spoke openly of taking the documents, transactions, and communication records to the police, convinced that doing the right thing was worth whatever fallout might follow. In Maxie's mind, integrity was a shield. In Tracy's, it was a suicide note. And worse, it was a suicide note written on the letterhead of deception, with Tracy's name indelibly linked to the disaster. Neutralizing Maxie temporarily was an option, a transfer to a remote assignment, a fabricated family emergency pulling her out of town, but such measures were stopgaps. Tracy knew Maxie's resolve. Once the immediate distraction passed, she would return, armed with righteous indignation and possibly evidence that had slipped through the cracks. No, the only way to ensure her silence permanently was to destroy her credibility entirely. The first stage of the operation was preparation. Tracy began with the raw materials, archived contracts, board meeting minutes, corporate emails, and financial reports. She didn't need to create the appearance of corruption from scratch. The truth was already messy enough to serve as a foundation. All she needed was to redirect the narrative so that every questionable action pointed not toward the board as a whole, but toward Maxie alone. She enlisted the help of discreet specialists, an accountant who could clarify the flow of funds, a document analyst skilled in reconstructing meeting notes, and a trusted tech contact who could recover and subtly edit archived email threads. Piece by piece, a new reality began to take shape. In this version of events, Maxie and Natalia had initiated a covert financial arrangement with Sonny, accepting funds they knew were tainted, and working behind the scenes to conceal the source from the rest of the leadership. Key meetings were reimagined so that Maxie's presence was highlighted, her statements twisted to suggest foreknowledge and intent. Even innocuous remarks in emails were reframed with careful cropping and selective omission. It was a work of art in deception, plausible, internally consistent, and, most importantly, difficult to disprove. Simultaneously, Tracy implemented a psychological offensive. She understood that evidence alone might not be enough. Maxie had allies, and allies could complicate the story. So she began a quiet campaign to isolate her. Publicly, she maintained a cordial, even cooperative demeanor, agreeing with Maxie on small, non-critical issues, occasionally conceding minor points in meetings. This performance disarmed Maxie, encouraging her to believe she was making headway in swaying Tracy's position. In private, however, Tracy seeded doubts in the minds of Brooke Lynn and Lucy, raising subtle questions about Maxie's judgment, her impulsiveness, her tendency to act independently without consulting the team. Each whisper was carefully timed, delivered in confidence, and never repeated verbatim, a drip feed of suspicion that began to erode the trust Maxie relied on. Brooke Lynn's role was more direct. Tasked with observing Maxie and reporting back, she initially framed it as familial obligation, helping ensure the company's stability. But as she saw the pattern of Tracy's machinations unfold, an unease began to gnaw at her. She recognized the trap being laid, and the inevitability of what would happen once it snapped shut. Yet loyalty, fear, and the knowledge that her own fortunes were tied to the outcome kept her silent. When the case file was finally complete, Tracy delivered it to a long-standing contact in law enforcement, someone who understood the art of prioritizing certain leads while letting others fade into obscurity. The chain of events that followed was swift and clinical. Maxie was summoned for questioning under the pretense of routine clarification, only to find herself confronted with a barrage of evidence that mapped her actions onto a criminal conspiracy. Every answer she gave was met with another document, another recording, another witness statement that fit seamlessly into the manufactured timeline. The arrest itself was a spectacle. Maxie was leaving the deception offices, her arms full of design portfolios, when two officers approached. The handcuffs clicked shut under the glare of camera flashes, and the whispers began almost immediately. Employees stared from behind glass doors, some wide-eyed with disbelief, others turning away quickly to avoid being drawn into the scandal. The footage hit the news within the hour, framing her as the central figure in a financial scandal linked to organized crime. For Tracy, the moment was a masterstroke, public, decisive, and devastatingly effective. For Brooke Lynn, it was the moment her complicity became unbearable. She watched Maxie's face as she was led away, the confusion and betrayal plain in her eyes, and knew she had played a part in it. Lucy, calculating as ever, recognized the strategic brilliance but couldn't shake the dread that if Tracy could orchestrate this against Maxie, she could just as easily turn the same machinery against anyone else. In the sterile chill of her cell, Maxie replayed every interaction of the past months, seeing the pattern now with painful clarity. The false alliances, the strategic hesitations, the seemingly harmless paperwork, it had all been deliberate, all part of a design she hadn't even realized she was walking into. Anger hardened into determination. She might be trapped now, but she would not remain so. She knew Tracy's pride in her own cleverness, and pride often led to carelessness. Outside, the arrest sent ripples through Port Charles. Sonny, though outwardly indifferent, recognized the risk of letting Maxie take the fall without intervention. If she decided to talk from prison, his name could be dragged deeper into the investigation. Anna and Jordan, both attuned to patterns of corruption, noted the convenient timing and began quietly probing for connections between Maxie's arrest and other power plays in the city. Mac, protective to his core, set aside every other priority to begin digging into the case, ready to confront Tracy directly if necessary. Tracy, meanwhile, sat in the Quartermain mansion with a glass of wine, reviewing the evening news as if it were a personal performance review. The anchors recited the charges with the solemnity of a eulogy, and she allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. In her mind, the threat was neutralized, the company's survival assured, and her position reinforced. Yet in the shadows, threads were already beginning to unravel. Brooke Lynn's conscience was eroding her silence. Mac's investigation was drawing closer to the forged evidence. And in her cell, Maxie was no longer just a victim, she was planning her counterattack. In Port Charles, even the most meticulous schemes have a half-life. Tracy believed she had written the ending to Maxie's story, but the truth was far more dangerous. She had only written the first act of a war that would eventually force her into the role she hated most, the hunted. When every element of her design was sharpened to a lethal point, Tracy executed the final step of her operation with the precision of a chess master delivering checkmate. The dossier she had assembled was more than a collection of falsified documents. It was a performance on paper, a web of contracts, doctored meeting transcripts, carefully edited email chains, and fabricated witness statements that, when viewed together, formed a perfectly believable narrative of Maxie's guilt. This was not a crude forgery. Every page had been crafted to blend seamlessly with genuine corporate records, every date and signature aligned with real timelines, every phrase echoing the language Maxie might actually use. It was the kind of deception that even a seasoned investigator would struggle to untangle, unless they already knew the truth. Tracy passed the file into the hands of a veteran investigator whose career owed more than a few debts to her influence. Their understanding was unspoken but absolute. The case would be fast-tracked, the framing airtight, the outcome inevitable. There would be no open-ended inquiries, no lingering doubts left for the press to exploit. Maxie would be the story, and the story would be closed. The summons came swiftly. Maxie, still believing that her cooperation might help clarify whatever misunderstanding had arisen, walked into the police station expecting a conversation. She was instead ushered into an interrogation room stripped bare of comfort, cold gray walls, a single metal table, 2 chairs, and a file folder waiting like an execution order. Across from her, the detectives opened the file and began methodically laying out each piece of evidence. A contract bearing her signature, funneled funds tied to Sunny's accounts, internal memos where her name was underlined, meeting notes that cast her as the central decision-maker in questionable transactions. The recordings were the worst, her voice, clipped and rearranged from legitimate discussions, now sounding as if she were openly acknowledging the illicit source of the funds. Maxie protested, explaining context, pointing out omissions, insisting that her words had been twisted. But each time she spoke, they countered with something more damning, more concrete, until her denials began to sound, to their ears and to the silent recording devices, like desperation. She realized, too late, that she was not there to clarify anything. She was there to be sealed into the narrative Tracy had so carefully constructed. By the time the questioning ended, the detectives had shifted from the pretense of polite inquiry to the formal, measured tone of procedure. The warrant was already signed. It was not a possibility, it was an inevitability. Outside Deception's headquarters, the arrest unfolded in full view of Port Charles. The glass facade of the building reflected the glare of afternoon sun as Maxie stepped through the revolving doors, only to be met by 2 uniformed officers. The moment the handcuffs locked around her wrists, camera flashes burst like gunfire. Reporters surged forward, shouting questions she couldn't answer, their voices competing with the steady clicks of camera shutters. Behind the glass doors, her coworkers froze, some stunned into stillness, others turning away quickly, unwilling to be caught in the gravity of the scene. News traveled with the speed of rumor in a small city. Within the hour, local channels were running the footage on loop, accompanied by bold captions about financial scandal and criminal conspiracy. Social media swelled with speculation, amateur sleuths dissecting the clips, dredging up old photos, inventing theories. In diners and salons, the conversation was the same: was Maxie an innocent scapegoat, or had she been playing a dangerous game all along? On the sidewalk's edge, Brooke Lynn stood with her arms crossed tightly, her expression carefully neutral, though inside her chest, guilt clawed and churned. She had not forged the documents, had not delivered them to the police, but she had known enough to suspect what was coming, and she had done nothing. Her silence had been complicity, and now it played on repeat in her mind as she watched Maxie being placed in the back of the patrol car. Maxie did not look at her directly, but Brooke Lynn felt the weight of her unspoken accusation all the same. Lucy, watching from the privacy of her office, experienced a different kind of chill. She had always admired Tracy's tactical brilliance, but this was a level of cold-blooded calculation that made her realize the truth. In Tracy's world, allies were temporary, loyalty was expendable, and survival was the only currency that mattered. Today, it was Maxie. Tomorrow, it could be her. In the holding cell, the shock of the arrest gave way to a deeper, colder understanding. Maxie sat on the narrow bench, the air around her thick with the sterile scent of disinfectant, the muted hum of fluorescent lights overhead. Her mind began to pull apart the last few months, replaying every moment with new clarity. She saw now the pattern she had missed in real time. Tracy's calculated agreement on trivial matters to lull her into confidence, the seemingly casual, routine documents slid across her desk for signature, the invitations to meetings where her presence was later twisted into proof of involvement. Every detail had been deliberate, every interaction a thread in the net that had now closed around her. Anger rose first, hot and sharp, but beneath it was the colder weight of betrayal. This was not the work of an enemy acting on impulse. It was the slow, patient dismantling of her credibility by someone she had once considered an ally. Tracy had not merely silenced her, she had rewritten her entire role in the company's history, casting her as a villain in a story she had never agreed to play. And yet, in that quiet, Maxie's mind shifted. If Tracy's greatest strength was her certainty that she had outmaneuvered everyone, then that arrogance could also be her undoing. Maxie began to think. Not of escape in the physical sense, but of dismantling the false narrative from the inside. Somewhere in the mass of forged evidence, there had to be imperfections, inconsistencies too subtle for Tracy to notice but glaring to someone who knew the truth. Somewhere, there had to be a way to pull a single thread that would unravel the tapestry Tracy had woven. Across town, ripples of the arrest were already shifting the political landscape. Sonny, whose own name had been whispered in connection to the scandal, began quietly weighing whether allowing Maxie to take the fall might backfire. Anna and Jordan, trained to see patterns beneath the surface, marked the timing of the arrest against other recent moves in Port Charles and found the alignment too neat to be coincidence. And Mac, whose protective instincts toward Maxie had never dulled, dropped every other priority to begin his own investigation. One that would inevitably lead him straight into Tracy's path. Tracy, meanwhile, sat in the Quartermain mansion, the evening news playing before her like a victory reel. The anchors recited the charges in solemn tones, the footage of Maxie's arrest looping behind them. To Tracy, it was confirmation that her strategy had been flawless. She had neutralized the threat, protected her own standing, and reminded everyone in her sphere exactly what happened to those who crossed her. But in Port Charles, no victory is ever final, and no secret stays buried forever. Unseen to her, the first cracks had already begun to form, cracks that would widen, shift, and eventually collapse the very foundation of the empire she believed unassailable. The news of Maxie's arrest did not just dominate the headlines. It became the kind of story that seeped into every corner of Port Charles, whispered in backrooms, dissected in boardrooms, and gossiped about over drinks in the city's most exclusive lounges. It wasn't just a legal development, it was a shift in the city's political and criminal weather, the sort of event that made old enemies reevaluate grudges and allies quietly test the strength of their loyalties. For Sonny, the implications cut deeper than most realized. He had worked carefully over the years to insulate himself from scandals that could draw too direct a line to his financial dealings, but this one had his fingerprints in places that couldn't simply be wiped clean. On paper, his involvement in Deception's funding was a matter of legitimate investment, except the money had been tainted, and the taint was public knowledge now. So long as Maxie sat in a cell, facing the possibility of years behind bars, the temptation for her to strike a deal with prosecutors would remain, and the easiest bargaining chip she had was Sonny's name. He told himself he could trust her silence, but Sonny had been in this game long enough to know that even good people broke under the right kind of pressure. The thought alone was enough to force him into motion. If helping her kept his own empire clean, then helping her became an act of self-preservation. Anna and Jordan were in a different kind of race. Their investigation into Sidwell and Marco was already weaving through a tangled web of illicit deals and strategic alliances that touched more corners of Port Charles than either of them liked. The timing of Maxie's arrest was too perfect, too surgically executed, to be coincidence. The removal of a potential whistleblower at the exact moment their case was gathering momentum had all the hallmarks of a preemptive strike from someone high on their list of suspects, or someone protecting them. That suspicion forced them to recalibrate their approach. Now, every thread of their investigation had to be examined in light of the possibility that Maxie's arrest was not just related, but integral to the larger picture they were chasing. For Mac, there was no strategy, no politics. Only the unshakable drive to protect his daughter. He knew Maxie's flaws, knew she could be impulsive, headstrong, even reckless. But he also knew her heart, and the accusations against her didn't fit. That was enough to send him into action. Years of experience on the force had taught him where to look for the cracks in a case, how to read the subtle tells of a fabrication, and how to find the people who might know more than they dared to say. Mac began with the basics. Who had handled the evidence first, who had taken the statements, and who had been present at every step of the chain of custody. He moved quietly but relentlessly, understanding that Tracy's kind of influence could close doors before he even knocked on them. Still, Mac had one advantage: he wasn't afraid to confront her directly if the trail led to her, no matter the fallout. Brooke Lynn's internal struggle was a quieter war but no less dangerous.